Welcome to Meshmen Studio. My name is Peter Aversten and today we're gonna do a journey together and it involves time travel. Do you know that time machines was not invented in the future but in the 17th century already by a woman called Marie McTime? And they're quite easy, they work like this. So this is me back in the day when I was preparing for my first speak down at FMX, and this was for Mari 1. So this is also me at FMX, and can you imagine, back at Mari 1 we didn't even have layers yet. Let's take a peek how I in the early days used Mari before layers was introduced. Okay, so I gotta know about Mari when I was working at Fido in Sweden. And at the time we were searching for a better way to texture dinosaurs for a documentary with David Attenborough. Now here we see the interface, and looking at the pop-out shader and channel list, we can see we only have shaders and channels. Shaders are in this example what channels are now in Mari, and channels will be a bit similar to layers actually. Yeah, so even in these very early days of Mari, I knew that I wanted to adopt a non-destructive workflow. I would take my shader and add my channels and any other effects I wanted to add to this shader. And when I started to get a slowdown in interactivity, I branched off this shader and baked it down into a channel. And that was my pre-comp workflow. And this one fed into another shader where my previous channel bake was the base for this new channel chain. So this essentially is a bit what bake points is today. After the FMX presentation, I had a conversation with Jack Grizzly, and he was the product manager of Mari at the time. And he asked me, what do you want to see? And I said, only one thing, and that was nodes. I didn't age a bit. It's time for another jump in time. Okay, so now we're in the Mari 2 era. We actually now got layers like Photoshop in Mari, and under the hood, actually in Mari, there is nodes right now, but Foundry was sneaky. They didn't expose them just yet. Hey, young Pete, do you mind showing the audience how we use Mari before nodes? So it's a bit in the line what I did for Mari 1 by utilizing pre-bake workflows. The whole thing was, so my layers were housed within groups, and whenever I need to branch off a channel with the layers, I essentially clone and merged the whole group. So that flattened the whole project down into one layer. And this layer I then shared or copy and pasted into a new channel as the base layer. That essentially is kind of a pre-bake workflow. The obvious problem with this workflow is it's really hard when you have a few of these channels to keep track of what channel goes where. So you have to be really meticulous in your naming and annotations around your project. And this is where a node-based workflow would have been so much better to use. Okay, so now we know that time travel is actually possible. And we also know that nodes was present in Mari 2 even. Hey Pete, do you mind showing how I first started to use nodes when Mari 3 was introduced? Now we're in Mari 3 land, and as I now finally got my nodes exposed to me, Foundry was a bit sneaky. They actually, in the first couple of versions of Mari, disabled the node graphs. You actually had to hunt around to find it. What is it I like about nodes? So yes, to me they represent a roadmap, and it gives me the flexibility to work non-linear and non-destructive. This is kind of the same way that I utilized Mari 1 and 2. I can actually build the structure in front of my eyes and see what dependency this branch has towards the other branch. First off, we build our main graph here doing whatever we can do in the layer stack. When we are happy or when we reach the point the interactive speed might be suffering a bit, what you do then, you take this specialty node called the bake point, and it's essentially mimicking the workflow I used in Mari 1 and 2 where I did a pre-bake, but now we have a node for this, so that's really cool. So there's no more guessing what layer needs to be copied to what channel or etc. And the beauty of this workflow, if I change something upstream to the bake point, it becomes dirty. And I could from this moment stop worrying if I made a change, will it come through? I could just look at my bake point, red is bad and green is good. Hey, young Pete, do you mind showing the audience a bit from that short that triggers all of those tutorials during the Mari 3 series? Så. Thanks, young Pete. I'll take it from here. Enough time travel for a bit. Let's examine what we can do in Mari 4 right here and right now. Okay, so before diving too deep into the nitty-gritty, let's take a look at the Mari interface as it looks now. And obviously it's gone through a number of changes since I first started using Mari, and this was back in 0.9 alpha, I believe. And it's kind of good because the original interface was, not the best when I look back at it now. So we have a few tabs here, and I actually just delete them. Like so, just gone. And I usually reshuffle the interface to have room for the node graph at the bottom. And you can obviously maximize and minimize as expected with a node graph. And I'm splitting the interface here so we can see the node properties as like the tall tab that I usually use, because there's a lot of properties in the node sometimes. I also add the image manager and the shelf to the side. And voila, we're in action. Okay, so now we have the interface ready, up and running for the node graph. But most people coming from the layer stack might feel a bit intimidated right now. So I'm gonna go through some of the techniques I use so you don't run to the hills immediately. Okay, so the obvious thing is to start with layers to understand our nodes. And yeah, so here's the channel with a few layers, and I've done something any layer artist would do. So I'm adding layers, procedurals, and groups. And as you can see, some is masked, and I have a few tweaks here and there. I have both adjustment as well as a few mask stacks, and this should feel quite familiar if you're coming from a layer background. And let's take a look now what Mari has done on its own without parental supervision. Oh my god, what the happened? Seriously, don't panic. It's not a big deal. We'll fix this. So I usually just select the channel node and use this command focus in the node graph and hit the L button, and this should lay out the nodes for us. The Focals channel is an extension pack feature, and I will try my best to highlight when I use an extension pack node or a feature throughout this demo. And if you don't know about extension pack for Mari, it's a collection of useful nodes and add-ons that was developed for Mari by a third-party developer, and I highly recommend using it with Mari. And while we're on the subject of development, Mari is actually not just a painting tool. It's also an open platform with development APIs to allow technical artists and studios to build their own custom workflows and still feel like they're part of Mari, and that's really awesome. Now let's get this show back on the road. It's better, but it's still looking quite nasty. So what we need to understand here, whenever you add a layer or an effect, Mari will always create a merge node for you, and this is so you can mask whatever effect you have just added. If I would build my own node from scratch, I would usually know whenever I want to mask something, and I would plan for it. That's why a custom build node graph is usually a lot lighter than if you would build the similar in using a layer stack. Let's create a quick example with a few nodes here. So I'm dropping down some nodes here to create something similar. And I have my base color and breakout pattern at the bottom. And we can see here that I'm adjusting the pattern using a brightness lookup. As I'm now tweaking the whole pattern, I don't need to merge the adjustment at this stage. Instead, I'm later merging the result on top of the base color. And if I would have used the layer stack, each layer would have had a merge node with possibility to mask at this stage. And here's an example where I have taken this a bit further, so we can see here how it actually ended up looking using the node graph. And it looks a bit different actually. I like being friendly to myself, so if I need to go on vacation, for example, when I come back, I want to remember what I did. So I added a few backdrops and annotations here and there, so I remember what I was up to. Okay, so now we know the basics of building with nodes, but what about nodes? What nodes do I use? Let's take a look at some of my favorite nodes. So the first node here is not really something you use to build with, but it's rather a radio node.
And I use this all the time to take away clutter in my graph. And the radio system works like this. You have a transmitter and a radio node, and whatever name you declare in the transmitter, if you drop down a radio node, you can then in the list pick this name up and connect. So yeah, I can section off a place for a specific effect, and once I'm happy with the result, I just broadcast wide and loud into the ether, and I can pick this signal up somewhere else in my node graph. And as a bonus feature, it makes my node graph look less like the local pasta place with noodles spilled all over the floor. Okay, so let's actually focus on a real node now. Okay, so when I'm using tile textures from Megascan and other material libraries, I often find myself wanting to interact with the maps in an easy way. And to do this, I use these specialty nodes from Extension Pack, where I can control the repeat and other properties from outside the node using something called a manifold. So in my example here, the manifold decouples my texture repeats and rotations, and I can set up a relationship between multiple nodes at the same time. And I'll throw in a bonus feature for you. Let's say that you want to control a secondary map but with another scale, and you want to control these two maps from a single node. And this is how you do it. You insert two image nodes and a manifold. Next up, you set up your initial repeat for the manifold. And for the second image node here, when you connect the manifold, in between this manifold and the image node, you can insert a multiply node and a float node to the B input. So I will use this float node to scale the second image node independently of the first. Now I set up the look between the two, and once I'm happy with this, if I now change anything in the top manifold, they will both scale as one, and that's kind of nifty, right? So another really cool pattern I use a lot is the scatter and splatter nodes from Extension Pack. So let's take a look at an example here where I want to cover an asset without too many repeats. And this is something that usually tiled and triplanal projection can produce if tiled enough. So first off, I drop down a splatter node here and hook up my skin texture into the input image tab. I then start to tweak the edge fall off, softness, distortion and roundness parameters. Once I'm happy with this, I then pay my attention into the amount multiplier tab here. And then a quick jump down into the size tab, and I start to tweak the pattern so it has overlap. Okay, so I know it doesn't look good now, but watch this. So we really want to randomize things here, and we can do this by going to the rotation section. And I pull the random rotation to its max here. And if you want to be really daring, I can do something similar to position and scale to further give some chaos in how the texture is applied. Okay, so now if I duplicate this node a few times and insert some of the other maps, and then hooking this up to a shader, we should have a shader ball covered with skin. And that's really freaky. Another really helpful node I use all the time is the histogram scan node. And this is one of these contrasting nodes that helps me to adjust values around. So I usually find myself dropping one of these bad boys into the mix when I want to create mask out of something like a cloud or a soft transition. For example, if you have a ramp and want to adjust where on the gradient your border is, the histogram scan node is the node for this purpose.
I'm lazy and I don't want to repeat the same thing over and over, so I build my own gizmos and atomic nodes. Let's take a look at how we can utilize the geochannels and the custom procedurals to build a smart mask, for example.
Okay, so you start off by baking textures like ambient, occlusion, curvature, and then you import them into your geochannel. And there is a few ways to do this, and I'm usually finding myself utilizing bake points for this actually. And as one of those TV chefs, I have a few bake points over here. So in these bake points, I have already declared the naming that I want to use in my project. I hook up my bake channels and rebake the bake points. Now if I drop down a geochannel node, and in this list here we can see, and I should have the previously declared geochannel names available for my disposal here. Yeah, so this feels kind of familiar to the radio system, but this geochannel system does broadcast into subgraph, and that's very important when you want to build like gizmos and atomic nodes. Now, if I create a group and start to build a node graph inside, I can then later turn this group into its own custom procedural for reuse. And in the spirit of TV chefs, here's another node here that are prepared for you. Okay, so going inside this node, we can see I utilize geochannels and also have tile nodes and different techniques to tweak the procedural mask here. And once I'm happy with the look of my mask, I can create this custom procedural and save it for later use or distribute to my team. I did say I was lazy, right? So let's quickly apply this mask to a completely different asset and see what we get. So I rebaked the ambient occlusion and curvature on this asset, and I declared the geochannel names using the same names as before. So now let's drag this mask I created earlier and see what we get. Okay, so I'm double lazy here, and yeah, it looks kind of cool. And as I have exposed the parameters inside the graph to the top node, I can now start to tweak this from outside, like a mask here, and that's really cool.
So that's awesome. We can now build away repetitive tasks and collaborate with others in a team. Let's take a look here at a real world example where we have like an asset that we want to apply some of these concepts on.
I have this foot of a bird here that I want to utilize some combination of traditional painting and procedural techniques. So I started by projecting paint and displacement from XYZ scanned maps. And if you don't know about XYZ, that's an awesome resource for animals and skin type stuff. And as you can see here, I'm only now covering the edges and the border details in this case, because I'm planning to utilize a procedural technique building on some of the workflows we saw earlier here. And later on, I will use some additional masking and hand-painted stuff. So let's take a look at how we can do that. And so here, after I painted the border edges and the details that really matters, I'm then shifting my focus here and using this splatter node. And I'm using a few different variants of this splatter node to get something to choose from. I'm kind of building a library of splatter nodes to mix between here. And when I'm happy with the nodes, I collect them in a single location using a backdrop just to know where I have them. Just to do some house cleaning, splatter nodes and some of the more advanced procedural nodes can be really heavy. So it's a good practice to offload some of the resources to Mari and bake down using bake points. And also, what I usually do is to keep an eye out on the FPS counter in the corner, just to see that I'm not really doing anything crazy here. Okay, so here I'm blending the different splatter textures with my projected displacement. And as you can see here, I'm previewing the bump through a Pixar surface shader. I'm utilizing radio nodes to mask in where I apply the different variations I previously baked. Once you have a full coverage, is to add a secondary layer where you add larger scale breakups. Next up here, I'm adding some color, and I'm going to utilize this node called Gradient Map 8. And that's a specialty node from Mari extension pack that I use here. So what this node does is I can choose different values from my displacement map. So let's imagine that the lower parts will be the darker and the whiter parts will be higher up, like a bump map essentially. And I can choose in what ranges it will apply what map. So I can essentially almost paint in 3 dimensions where I have a few different skin types and they all mix in depending on the height of the material. Obviously, we need to add some more details, and I'm utilizing here a histogram scan in this example just to target a certain value, and then I'm painting using a regular paint node on top to add like breakup details on top of everything here. So once I'm happy with the initial skin texture, I pay attention to the specular roughness. So I'm utilizing similar techniques to the skin color, but this time I'm using them to drive the roughness map. So the question is, do I want rougher values between the scales or on top of the scales? And it's quite easy now to just dial this around and see what you get here. And now I'm shifting my focus to the claws here. So I'm gonna do something really quick here to get the first version out of the door as soon as possible here. So I'm starting by dropping down a procedural color node, and I'm utilizing a hard tile texture to give some randomness to this color. Next up, I'm using a thickness bake, and I'm running this through an histogram scan yet again. I'm multiplying the result back over the previous color. Next up here, I'm creating a cloud with some warm colors. So my plan here is to actually use this cloud and apply it using a ramp. And to be able to actually target where I want to apply this ramp, I'm using a histogram scan to level the ramp. So I'm essentially creating a mask out of it. And that's it for the nails at this stage.
So as you can see, we can use a combination of procedural and painting techniques to create something that's both flexible and complex at the same time. But how do we mix between different materials in a predictable way? That's what the Mari material system is for. Let's have a look.
So what is the material system? Yeah, so in its basic form, it builds on having a vendor shader. So this could be V-Ray, Arnold, or in my case, I'm using RenderMan shader here. So you're choosing what shader you're targeting, and you create one of these material containers. And the material container has all possible outputs that is declared in the shader. So you blend between materials using a special multi-channel merge node. And you do this by auto-connecting the multi-channel merge and the material. It will connect all of the ports at the same time. Okay, so here I'm dragging a few materials I created earlier into my node graph, and I want to blend these together. So when I have the two materials selected, I hit the M button to merge them together. And at this stage, the material connected to the over port will fill the object. And we can remedy this by making a mask. To get something quick here, I'm utilizing a wear and tear mask from the extension pack. I could, of course, have utilized one of my own procedurals that we created earlier as well. And when I'm happy tweaking the mask, I'm starting to add some additional details that I'm adding here by hand on top of all of this. So next up, I'm gonna add here a dirt material on top of all of this, so we tie this together. Yet again, here's some additional tweaking, and we're off to the races. And now here I'm utilizing the export manager just to export my texture out, because I want to apply these in Katana just to see my progress here. The Mari preview shader is really good, but yeah, nothing beats the real thing, really. Okay, so back in Mari here, I want to now take a look here inside one of these materials so we understand what's going on under the hood. So yeah, it's quite simple. I have a few values and a few tile nodes driving the material. And the only custom thing I made is the index or refraction procedurals. So I created these custom procedurals using similar techniques to the mask procedural, but instead of having a mask, I'm now driving index or refraction value. To actually create the material, you use procedural techniques. I know, another reason to learn the node graph, right? And for the materials to be usable outside in the main node graph or in the layer stack, you can expose the parameters from the nodes inside of the material graph. And from the outside or in the interface, you can see these parameters you now exposed, and you can start to interact with the material. When you're ready to publish the material to your shelf or a material library, you generate the thumbnail and go to the export menu and export it as an MMA file. You can either let Mari generate the material preview, or as in my case, I made a Katana thumbnail scene and I actually offline render my material previews using RenderMan.
So now we know a bit about the Mari material system. But did you forget about the bird? We need to blend those materials. Let's get on to it.
Okay, so while you were busy learning about the material system, as in a true TV chef spirit, I prepared another material in the form of the harder material seen on some birds on top of the foot and on the shin. So I started off by dropping down a color node followed by another color node here. And I merged it using a curvature and a histogram scan to contrast the curvature. Next up, I added another color node. Looks like I like color nodes, hey? And this time I masked the color using a thickness bake. And I inverted that one and contrasted using this histogram scan node here, we can see. And this scratchy pattern here, I'm using a splatter node, and it's merged here on top with very low opacity, and this gives me just some hints of smaller details here. And then I decided to raise the exposure here a bit using a global adjustment. And after this I created another splatter node here, and this one has quite a hard edged look, and this pattern here is from the extension pack collection. It's a really nice one. And I'm masking this scatter node using yet another curvature that is also contrasted here. And here we can see here I added a tiled node, and this one I graded using an HSV here just to alter the look a bit. And this tile node is masked using a combination of splatter and curvature nodes that are merged together. So after this I wanted to bring some contrast around edges here, and to achieve this I used a cloud pattern, and I masked it by a curvature and yet another histogram scan node. And the last piece of the puzzle here is I'm taking the curvature since earlier and I'm just histogram scan and inverting it and then applying it back here just to get the look I wanted here. As you saw in the material demo, I used procedural materials housed within groups. But what if you want to turn something you made in the main graph into a material? Bake points to the rescue. So as we know, we can use material nodes to blend, and I'm planning to utilize bake points to broadcast into material containers. And I do this to combine work done in the main graph, but utilizing the ease of setting up the blending of the material using the material and the material merge nodes. Prior to the material system, I actually had to build all of these nodes by myself, and that took a long time, so I'm really happy when this was adopted. So this is what you need to do. When you're happy with the material in the main graph, you bake it out and declare a geochannel name. And inside a material group, you pick up the same name using a geochannel node. So I've gone through here and done this for all my main materials. So now I'm basically using the material nodes to handle the blending between the materials. So now it's up to me to paint what material goes where. Now we can see here where I have integrated the materials a bit more. And I also add a dirt material, and this one was a procedural dirt that I integrated.
So if you want to know more about the Mari material system, I made an 8.5-hour course in collaboration with Gnome Workshop. Let's take a quick look and see what this project is all about.
So I basically took the old Gatling asset we saw earlier. It's now completely remodeled and have new UVs, and it should hold up for 2021 and onwards. So in the class I go much deeper into material creation, physical properties and strategies how to handle complexity for production type assets found in many of today's blockbuster movies. And let's take a look here at the final result of the asset inside the Mari here. And here we can see the main graph, and it's quite a lot going on here actually. I guess you can see some familiar techniques being applied here, right? Let's check out the final turntable here as well. And for all of you render nerds out there, the asset was textured using the RenderMan shader, but the principle still applied to any render engine. So yeah, go and check it out at the Gnome Workshop.
Okay, I'm gonna leave you here and see what's new in Mari 7. See you there!
Oh my god, it's everything I ever dreamt of, and more!